you like the music,
The
Claire?
music there. I love the music. Yeah.
I've got a big
I've got a big
somewhere.
somewhere.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Okay.
Where's that coming?
Where's that coming?
I always do. Every time I've done this, there's been an echo.
We also have a delay.
Do we?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to turn my sound down on this thing, and hopefully it'll be okay. Anyway, right. So that seems to be better. Anyway, so welcome to this live Q&A session with Claire Fudge. Claire, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm glad it's all working and we can hear each other. We had a few disasters along the way, Claire, with this new setup. I've got a load of gadgets, and it's getting them all to work at the same time has been interesting. So there's been a few. You should have to watch the back catalogue of live broadcasts where we've gone through all our faults and things. But anyway, so this is working, which is working well. So Claire's a clinical dietitian from Fourth Discipline. We've known each other a while, haven't we, Claire?
We have, yeah, for a number of years.
Yep. We met on a tri-camp back in the deep and dark past.
Yeah, Lanzarote.
Yeah. And obviously been working together since. You've been working quite closely with a few of our athletes. Do you want to do a little intro yourself, Claire?
Sure. Thank you, and thanks for inviting us on. It's always great to be a part of working with a squad like Do 3. And yeah, so my as you kindly introduced me, I'm a clinical dietitian by background and still do some work clinically, but also I'm a high performance nutritionist as well, so working in sport. And I've worked within sport for about 12 years now, and then worked as a clinical dietitian for over 16 years. Wow. Not to give my age away or anything. So and my experience really is in a number of different sports, but primarily my love is triathlon. So that's where I spend most of my time in terms of working from a nutrition perspective.
Yeah. Okay. And what about your triathlon, your own personal triathlon background? What's that like?
Bumpy, I would say. No, I'm very competitive and love the world of triathlon and love the ups and downs, should I say, and the competitiveness of triathlon. I think certainly over the last sort of 5 years, I think you'll probably agree, we've seen kind of it explode in terms of numbers of triathletes getting out there, and certainly more endurance athletes. So certainly the fields are becoming sort of deeper in terms of numbers of athletes out there to compete against, and really high quality athletes as well.
Yeah, the competition certainly seems to be getting higher. The quality of the competition seems to be getting higher and higher all the time, doesn't it? I can remember when I first did a race, and you look at qualifying times for Kona or something like that, and they were, you could qualify Ironman UK at just over 11 hours, whereas now you're getting down closer to 10, I think, to get there. The quality's certainly gone through the roof. So what kind of proportion of athletes are triathletes, and what's the kind of spread across your clients, would you say?
So I'd say in terms of, so I still do some work clinically. So I've worked pretty much in every area of medicine, and I think that's given me a really good background in terms of working with athletes as well. And I'll sort of come on to that maybe a little bit later on. But in terms of, so clinically, I probably work with 10% of my clients are clinical at the moment, although I work in the world of eating disorders, which unfortunately, but very nicely crosses into the world of sport as well, and particularly with my work with a lot of triathletes. But I would say that from a sports perspective, probably about 70% are triathletes. I also work with young athletes, sort of between 16 and 18-year-olds in high performance pathway. So that's from Hockey England and Netball England, volleyball, motorsports. I'm trying to think of the rest of and I work with a few weight-related sports like boxing as well.
Right.
So, but really, in terms of sort of my specialist area, I would say it's triathlon. I think having a background of doing endurance triathlon myself, I think really helps in terms of how I can support athletes as well, and really sort of that deep understanding. I think it's really important if you're choosing to work with any sort of professional. You would come to a triathlon coach for triathlon coaching, and you go to a swim coach for swim coaching specifically. I think if you're looking for a performance nutritionist, then you need to make sure that it's for your sport. Otherwise, there appears to be sort of, I think the advice you get wouldn't necessarily, it may well be correct, but I don't think they'd have necessarily that sort of understanding about kind of the long days that some of us work and how we pack in training around it and what that means in terms of trying to prepare for your day ahead, but also trying to recover as well.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously as a coach, I see a lot of people coming into the sport who've got little to no knowledge about how to eat well, how to fuel for their training and for their racing and their recovery. Yeah. But obviously, having worked with you for a while, kind of truly opened my eyes up to all the different kind of the elements that are involved in deciding how to eat well, and timing the food and working it around your your working hours and obviously your training as well is quite tricky. It's tricky for someone who's quite experienced to do it. Never mind somebody who's fairly new to the sport. So we're here to answer some questions today. So if anyone's got any questions, tri-related or nutrition-related questions that you think you'd like answered, then obviously fire those away. We've got a few questions to start off with, but just before I go through the first one, then. Yeah, I've just got some messages coming in. If you just write the questions onto the comments within YouTube itself, they should pop up on my screen, and I'll do my best to kind of go through those. So, just got one from Nick. Let's see if I can get this on the screen here. Actually, let's see if this works. There we go. So, question from Nick. I happen to know Nick. Hello, Nick. Looking forward to finding out about some nutrition gems. There we go, Claire. No pressure.
Like ice gems.
Ice gems, yeah, they're a favourite. Oh, it's gone. I've got to be quicker at reading them out. It's gone. It's gone already. The question is: are there any foods to eat which will help running at altitude, or anything to stay away from which could help? So I happen to know that Nick does a lot of ultra running. Does the Mont Blanc marathon, that kind of thing. So I think that's probably where that's coming from. So I don't know if you've got any take on that.
Well, Nick, it sounds like you've got some kind of awesome plans there in terms of ultra running. So and the world of ultra running is quite different in terms of nutrition compared to triathlon, and there's a number of reasons for that in terms of the intensity at which we're working at, and that's even compared to our endurance sort of Ironman distance triathlons. So in terms of nutrition at altitude, things to be aware of in particular are hydration and also the effect on appetite as well, and gastric emptying, so the speed at which food and fluid is emptying from your stomach, and those can have a big effect on actually how we're fueling ourselves and hydrating ourselves. So I'd say before you even start looking at particular foods, because there's no particular foods in general that are going to help with altitude per se, but actually thinking about how does it affect your appetite, and therefore are you fueling sufficiently for what you're doing. What I would say is certainly thinking about your carbohydrate needs. So if it's depending on where you're racing, if it's hot or humid, we know that can increase our body's needs for carbohydrate. And at altitude in general, it may also increase our needs for carbohydrates over fats and proteins in terms of the actual training or racing itself. But yeah, I would really kind of strongly get you to sort of think about your hydration and your appetite, which is or can be affected. But yeah, generally your carbohydrate needs would be increased.
Okay, thanks for that, Claire. Nick, if you've got any follow-ups to that, and you want to ask anything else, obviously just fire it across, and it'll pop up on the screen there. So another question we've had coming from this one's coming from Instagram is could you just give us some comments on how you can adapt your nutrition and diet during not lockdown? Presumably they're talking about obviously kind of around about training rather than more generally.
Hmm. So lockdown's been interesting, and I think I've lost track of how many weeks in we are to lockdown now, 6, 7, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's been very interesting because I think, and Dave, please comment on what you feel as well. But certainly working with a lot of athletes, I think we've got a lot of athletes out there that are actually possibly tipping into overtraining because those with time on their hands are actually doing more maybe than they'd be doing when they're maybe in a workplace or place of work. And I think whilst it's given routine to a lot of people, and which has been really, really important. I think what it has done is, although we may not be able to swim, a lot of us has been substituting it with other things. And what I've found is that we kind of have two groups of kind of this kind of split where there are certainly sort of people who have had more time to be able to focus on their nutrition, and actually they've realised that actually having time to be able to prepare meals, so things like lunch for a lot of people are now happening, or they might be doing a very sort of structured morning training. They actually have time to have breakfast afterwards, so their post-training fueling has been better. They actually have time to have some lunch in the middle of the day. They might do an afternoon session rather than evening session training. So what I've found is for some athletes, actually their fueling strategy has been so much better. For others, there's been almost and quite interestingly, almost a fear of or panic about what am I going to do because I'm not doing as much training. And I presume that's kind of maybe volume in terms of where the swim has disappeared. And some athletes really sort of panicked or cutting back or not knowing what to do, almost in kind of like rabbit in headlights, almost kind of effect.
Yeah.
And then we've got other athletes that are maybe kind of emotionally eating a little bit as well, kind of very, very anxious. That might be under eating, but also we've certainly seen people that are overeating. So whether that's out of boredom or anxiety, sort of driven at home as well. So I don't know what your experiences have been in terms of athletes with training at the moment.
Yeah, well, yeah, the training volume certainly has, well, it certainly hasn't gone down, the overall volume. Most of the athletes I deal with are replacing their swims with some other form of exercise, and that more often than not is cycling. Yeah, and I think you're right, and certainly in terms of the kind of anxiety eating side of things. I mean, I can put my hand up to that one for sure, because I'm at home more. In fact, I'm training more because rather than being poolside every morning, I'm now on the bike, which I wasn't doing before. For my training's gone up, and I'm terrible for being in the house and sit at my desk for too long. And you just kind of, I don't know if it's boredom or whether it's just, I get a little bit anxious. I stay at my desk for too long. You just fancy a treat and you go off and disappear. So it's very easy to kind of slip into some bad habits there. And I've certainly had similar feedback from other athletes as well. A lot of athletes are really worried about their weight at the moment in terms of, am I just putting a few pounds on that I shouldn't be? So I'm getting quite a few comments about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
I think it's interesting because I guess a lot of athletes don't really know whilst they may be able to know when their training looks like swim, bike, run, for example, that kind of setup that they've had before, and maybe at this time of year they've been very used to kind of what their intake might look like, and therefore what their weight or body composition looks like at kind of May time. And I guess we're thinking, May time, we've got athletes ready to race or racing or having already raced. And I think athletes are very used to their body composition being slightly different, and whether that's that they've tailored their nutrition or not, but as training volume and intensity has periodized and changed for this part of the season, athletes are very used to their bodies looking slightly different. And I think that's been really difficult for a lot of athletes because we're not used to not having the swim element, and or for most triathletes anyway. And so I think people are panicked as to what does that mean in terms of energy expenditure? Well, they may not think like this, but in terms of the amount of energy that I'm burning up during swimming, and what does that mean in terms of nutrition? And actually, when we're replacing with a bike session or some hard bike sessions, actually effectively we could be creating more of an energy deficit that way than we were swimming. So depending on how hard you are swimming. So it's a really interesting time, and I guess it's the unknown, isn't it? It's the unknown about what that looks like in terms of what that effect will have on our body composition. But one of the things that I would say is use this time as an opportunity to really sort of focus on your nutrition. And actually, if you are finding yourself grazing, you were picking up on, is it boredom, is it not boredom? Well, actually ask yourself those questions, because usually you'll be able to find that answer. And if you have eaten only 2 hours ago, and you've refueled properly from your morning's training session, the question is, are you actually hungry or not? And that is a good question, because actually if we've refueled properly, probably, but maybe not necessarily, it may not be real hunger. It could be something else. And therefore, ask yourself these questions. What's driving that hunger? Is it boredom? Is it anxiety? If you're in an office setting or at work, when would you usually then eat again? So you could actually start to really question your own appetite and hunger, and become a little bit more intuitive maybe about eating. So using this time to really question hunger. And it's okay to know if you it's okay to kind of question whether it's hunger or fullness and not know the answer to it, because we're so used to ignoring all those natural sort of signs and signals as well.
I guess just being at home, you have more time to think about the way your body's feeling, and if you're out at work, you're busy all the time, and you wouldn't necessarily just kind of notice that you're feeling so hungry, I guess, and you just kind of carry on going through the working day. But certainly sitting at home more, you do seem to be slightly more aware of whether you actually are hungry or not, or whether you're just there's something else is triggering it. I don't know, but it certainly helps to not have so many treats in the house. I know that, because it's have a look at this I've got here. I've got a huge box of chocolates right next to me. Look.
Have you? Well, I guess I think it's also, it's interesting you picked up on the word treat there, isn't it? Because is calling something a food a treat actually helpful or not helpful? And I guess that's a whole other conversation to have, because by labeling food, we're not sometimes helping ourselves. And I often work with athletes in terms of really trying to take those labels off food, in terms of that's good, that's bad, that's a treat, that's for training, that's for fuel. Actually, all food is there to be enjoyed. And I like to look at it in terms of, actually, we can have any food we like, but let's try and optimize and make the best of the nutrition we can around our training. But if we decide to have something that we really fancy, so say it is that chocolate, whatever you've got in that box beside you, or say it is, that cream cake or scone and cream or whatever it might be that you really fancy, recognize that you just really fancy it and enjoy it, rather than saying that it's something I shouldn't have had, or it's a bad food. Are there really good and bad foods? Not really, because actually, even if we think about very fast release carbohydrates, there's a time and place to have them. For some of my athletes who love things like crunchy nut cornflakes, do you know what? There is actually a time to have crunchy nut cornflakes.
I love crunchy nut cornflakes.
But don't have them the whole time. But if you're really short on time and you haven't had a snack properly before training, then actually crunchy nut cornflakes is really quick release carbohydrate. So it's all about thinking, actually, when do we have these kind of foods? So there's no good and bad foods. And I think by taking these labels away, actually decreases some anxiety a little bit, and also helps prevent us from feeling unnecessarily guilty about eating as well.
So what kind of treats do you have then? Have you got like an angelic kind of perfect diet?
No, of course I haven't. There's no perfect diet, Dave, and that's one thing that I would say. And in terms of, I would say nutrition is all down to the individual as well, and that's very much how I work with athletes. And as I'm sure you do. We have equations for working out dietary requirements. We have suggested guidelines about how much protein we should have per kilogram of body weight, how much carbohydrate, etc. And they're all starting points for us. But actually, the reality is that every athlete is an individual and has individual needs. And I'm very much a believer in listening to our own bodies and being intuitive about what we need. But
Yep.
sometimes we also need to encourage ourselves to be eating certain things at certain times to optimize that training or that recovery or that racing as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a time and place for everything. Absolutely.
That's good. That's good to hear. And just in terms of when you were talking, then it's reminded me of one of the questions we've had come in from Corinne about, can we have a reminder to how to calculate macronutrients needed for a hard training day and easy and rest day, please?
Well, if you're going to calculate them, do you know what they mean? Is the first thing. So I presume, and thank you, Corinne, for the question. I think she probably means in regards to carbohydrate. I would imagine in terms of energy needs.
Uh-huh.
But there's a whole range of carbohydrate energy need equations, which are really super simple to work out. And we tend to start with a range for kind of lower amounts of carbohydrate, obviously on days when we're not doing as much training, and then a really heavy day. So we might take a double hard training session. So you might have maybe a double turbo day, or it could be one of your long weekend rides and a brick session. So those kind of days, you're looking at the top end range of carbohydrates per kilogram body weight. So you might be looking at, but not for everyone, maybe looking at the region of from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates. So that doesn't mean if you work it out, say, that works out to 500 grams of carbohydrates or 600, 700, 800 grams of carbohydrates. That doesn't mean 800 grams of pasta. It means of carbohydrate. So you then need to work out how much carbohydrate you're getting from each food. So you can work out that equation, but remember, it doesn't mean that you're sat there with 500 grams worth of carbohydrate of pasta, and that's all you have for the day. So, it is about the grams of carbohydrate within a food, and how you spread that across the day. And then at the lower end, you are looking down towards maybe between sort of 2 and 4 for that kind of low level training as well. But every athlete is an individual, and if we have an athlete who is trying to manipulate body composition, then we might be working slightly different with their carbohydrate needs, and also doing some more work metabolically with how we use carbohydrates and training. But also, at the other end of the scale, we may have athletes that are struggling to retain their weight and trying to improve really their weight for health purposes, and their carbohydrate requirements are going to be set slightly higher anyway. So it's very individual in terms of athletes.
Okay. Well, Corinne's just come back actually saying carbs and protein she's interested in.
Okay, so protein is not going to change depending on the training day. So your protein needs are actually worked out. We can work them out, or the old school way to work them out is per kilogram of body weight, but that's one of the easiest ways for us to start looking at it. And it very much depends on your body composition requirements or needs. So if you're in a period of injury or decreased training load or manipulating body composition, your protein needs are going to be slightly higher per kilogram of body weight compared to maybe if you're doing a little bit less training. It also depends on the sport you're in as well in terms of grams per kilogram of body weight. But that's a little bit of the older guidelines, really. We know now that actually protein needs to be spread out across the day, so that we're looking at 0.25 grams per kilogram of body weight in a single sitting, which is works out to around about between sort of the 20 and 40 grams of protein. And then we need to be eating regularly throughout the day.
Okay.
But we don't necessarily, although we have these equations there, one thing that I would say is, actually, if we just look at a very simple, balanced diet where you're eating before and after training properly, without even looking at those equations, mostly when we actually work out what people are doing, when they've got that right, it's almost like the equations have already been done. So, sometimes we can use all these numbers and figures, and actually the simplistic way to do it is just get your baseline diet right first. And more often than not, you've already worked it out without having to do the calculation.
And if people are struggling with working out what they should be having, are there any easy kind of methods to do that? Any kind of apps or data, spreadsheets or anything like that you can use?
Yeah, I think I think there's a time and a place for tracking diet, and certainly the way that I work is that I would dip in and out using um, trackers with athletes, because I think sometimes too much focus, and you might be able to sort of comment on this in terms of using things like Training Peaks. Sometimes too much focus, for example, if they don't meet their or increase their FTP, for example, or their CSS or whatever. Actually, they're figures at the end of the day, and each of our athletes are individuals. And what I would say is I tend to dip in and out of tracking their diet. But if you're going to collect that data, what are you going to do with it? Because if we're just going to collect the data and worry about it, then there's no point in collecting the data. So if we're going to collect it, then do it over a certain number of days and then analyze it and then decide what you're going to do with that data. So, I have athletes that might track every single day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But unless you do something with that data, it's worth nothing, essentially. So yes, we can track it on there. But the most important thing, rather than almost tracking it on an app, is actually going back to basics, thinking, what am I doing every single day? Am I eating before training? Am I eating after training? Am I getting in carbohydrates before training? Am I having carbohydrates and protein after training? If I've got a long day, what am I eating? So a long training session on the bike, say out for 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever it might be. Am I fueling that correctly before you can start tracking? So I think it can be useful, but remembering that a lot of apps also have their own problems as well, in terms of, they're only as good as the data that you put in. If you're putting in average servings, do you know what an average serving is? Do you have an average serving? And what I wouldn't want people to start doing is weighing everything, because that's certainly, who has time to weigh everything? That's certainly something that I wouldn't suggest. Actually, using household measures or hand measures are really good. So in using using our hands to actually think about portions a little bit. But remember that also some of the suggested portions that are out there as well. So this average portion, we manage athletes, and athletes' needs are different to the average Joe that's out there, whatever that might be. A lot of those calculations guidelines are based on an average 75 to 80 kilogram man or woman. I mean, we can't try and put a round peg into a square hole. We've got to think very individually about athletes and about nutrition.
And I think when you came to do the workshop with us a few months ago, and you kind of demonstrated that a lot of foods are naturally packaged into kind of portion sizes, aren't they, almost? So I guess once you've been doing it for a while, you get to know exactly what a portion looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you've got your basics there, so what I often would teach athletes as well is, if you've got your basics of and this is very basic, and then you can build on that individually, is thinking, well, actually, if after training I need around about 20 to 35 grams of protein, again, that's not the weighed amount of food, it's the amount of protein that's within that product. So if we're thinking about an animal source, it's really super simple to work out. So if you were thinking about sort of 20 grams of protein, let's take 3 eggs, for example, average size. Eggs would be about 20, 23 grams of protein. So once you start working that in your head, and I think that's what you're referring to in terms of portion sizes, you can start working it out really, really easily. After training, if I had 3 eggs, essentially, and then I put that with a couple of pieces of toast and maybe a little bit of color like spinach or tomatoes or whatever, you'd be meeting your basic carbohydrate and protein needs for after a session. So it's very easy to work out once you have a few ideas of basic how much protein is in something, how much carbohydrate is in something. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a much better way to start rather than just tracking data.
Yeah. Okay. Should we look for another question then? See what else we've got. Got a question here from Sarah. Now, bearing in mind I'm reading these out without properly vetting them, it could say anything. I'm hoping it's nutrition based, but it's a question from Sarah Northover. I hate cooking, so what simple lunchtime meals can I do that are high in protein, and in brackets apparently even more important for menopausal ladies, tasty, quick and easy and filling?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So firstly, let's just clear up the menopause and protein aspect to it. protein is important for all of us athletes. And actually, when you look at the menopause, the reason that protein may become a little bit more important is basically that as our estrogen levels drop, that in terms of metabolism, we may find it a bit more difficult to manage our weight. So protein helps with satiety as well. But actually, when we're looking at increasing protein, if we look at the general guidelines for protein for somebody who isn't an athlete, we're looking at between certainly in the UK, 0.8 to 1 gram of protein for every kilogram of body weight. So if you were a 60 kilogram lady, for example, that would equate to around about sort of 50 to 60 grams of protein. So what does high protein then mean? Well, athletes, we're already talking about higher amounts of protein anyway. So Sarah, if you're an athlete, you may already be eating the right amount of protein. I don't know whether she was looking at vegetarian, vegan sources or animal containing protein products, but it's very, very easy with animal protein to actually get the amount of protein in that you need in your diet. For something quick and easy at lunchtime, I would always go like eggs. If you're at home, eggs is super quick and easy. And I know you said not to have to cook something, but seriously, scrambled eggs, an omelette, a frittata takes no time at all. And like I said, 3 eggs essentially is about your 21 grams of protein. So really, really super simple and super quick to do as well. Wraps are really great. So wraps, using up things that might be in your cupboard. So at the moment, I'm sure we've all got loads of like tins of things like chickpeas or butter beans or random tins of pimento beans or black-eyed beans that you've bought and never used. Making something with those that is super quick and easy again. Even using sort of a can of tomatoes to go with it and a few spices. You could heat that up in the microwave and have a toasted wrap with that, and then put some lettuce and some salads in there, maybe a bit of avocado. Again, really super simple and really quick to make.
Okay.
So there are a few ideas.
Good. And Sarah's just followed that up, actually saying not vegan or vegetarian. I have to have gluten-free as well, just to complicate things.
No, it's not complicated at all. Okay. So gluten-free wrap, there you go. That's super simple and quick.
Yeah.
There's some great sources, of course. Looking at things like that are naturally gluten-free. So things like quinoa and rice, actually. Although Sarah, you eat animal products, quinoa and rice are both good sources of good sources of carbohydrates that also have some protein in as well. So they're good things to be trying to include in our diet just to get a bit more protein. But really, to give you an idea, Sarah, if you were to have a standard like little tin of tuna, that's between 17 to 25 grams of protein, depending on the size of the tin of tuna. So really, you can really, really easily get the amount of protein that you need for the day. So in terms of the evidence for menopause and protein, as an athlete, you're probably already getting a higher amount anyway.
Okay. Yeah, good. Well, hopefully that answers your question there, Sarah. I'm sure you can boil an egg. Then I'm sure you're capable of cooking that far. She'll come back with something in a minute after that. Okay, so we've got
thinking.
We've got a similar, well, not similar question, but I can see the word menopausal in there as well. So from Pat, being vegan, here we go. Here's Pat. Being vegan and menopausal, would be interested in pre, during, post-race nutrition. Also, what Claire thinks about soya, as some things that you read recommend it, and other people seem to be against it.
Okay. So I'll pick up on soya first. So soya is really interesting. The current evidence, it depends if we're talking menopause or whether we're talking about the phytoestrogen effects and some of the older studies that were in those effects on things like breast cancer, for example, and ovarian cancer. So current evidence is that actually soya products are safe for us to use. In actual fact, we still know the evidence for the use of soya when you are menopausal or premenopausal can actually help to decrease the number or frequency of hot flushes that you might have as well. So there's some really good evidence out there in terms of including soya within your diet. We are looking at about 3 sources of soya a day, actually. So it is a fair bit to be getting into the diet. So that could be, remember, you can use things like tofu, for example. And tofu is great for a quick stir fry or marinating some and having little blocks in the fridge as a snack. So that's really super simple and quick to do. You might want to use soya milk sometimes, like if you're making like a nice birch muesli, it kind of goes quite creamy if you're doing that overnight. So essentially, we'd look at one source of soya, a bit like we would in terms of like a dairy source. So like a glass of milk would be one portion, or a pot of soya yogurt would be one portion, or a portion of tofu would be a portion as well. So soya is good to include. What we know about soya also is that obviously during menopause, because we don't have we have lacking or lower levels of estrogen, that also has an effect obviously on our bone health as well, and increases our risk of osteoporosis and fractures. So actually making sure that we're optimizing vitamin D and calcium is super important. So we do know that if you're excluding dairy, if you can have dairy in your product, that's in your diet, that's great. If you're excluding dairy, that we know that soya as a milk alternative, as a plant milk alternative, actually has the same absorption in our bodies of calcium. So it's similar to dairy products. So there's some real advantages really to having soya. We don't know about its effect in terms of like a powder, like a protein powder, and whether we actually get as good effects in terms of muscle protein synthesis, so the creation of muscle or regeneration of muscle. I can't remember the other bit to the question.
Yeah. Interested in being vegan, being interested in pre, during, post race nutrition generally.
Okay. Well, vegan shouldn't stop you in terms of having any sort of different nutritional strategy compared to a non-vegan, in terms of certainly pre and during. The only thing post-race that you'd need to think about is how you're going to get that protein in terms of recovery. So I just touched on soya there a little bit. Of course, we've got other protein sources that we could use. So if you were thinking about after a race and you really can't face food, so often after we've raced or a really hard session, sometimes athletes really struggle with their appetite after kind of having their heart rate so high for such a period of time, or you may feel quite sick. So try and rehydrate as quickly as you can. And with that, I would say that if you do struggle after races, actually using something liquid with protein and some carbohydrates in is a really good idea. And then back it up with food as soon as you feel you can. So within the hour, if possible. And you could use a soya or a pea-based protein sort of shake for that. That would be really simple and easy for you to take with you to a race, and just making it up kind of on the go. And there's also some pre-made ones now as well. So there shouldn't be anything different in terms of pre and during, in terms of being a vegan or the menopause. That doesn't change your needs at all. I guess one thing to track would just be whether you have peaks and troughs in your energy levels. That could be something that you might experience, which may be different from before you were menopausal.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully that's answers your question there, Pat. You mentioned again during the workshop, might be worth just kind of covering a little bit about the timings in terms of protein intake post exercise, because I think the kind of things seem to be shifting the advice on that. What do you
mean by shifting? So tell me what kind of you've been reading, or what you feel that athletes have been doing more recently.
Yeah, well, it always used to be, you try and get your protein in within 20 minutes, half an hour of finishing whatever exercise it is. But I understand that the advice is that may actually not be completely true, and that you can actually still get most of the benefit from that, taking that protein in quite a long time afterwards. So there may be not the need to rush out and have your protein bar or whatever it is you take straight after a race.
So it's interesting because you and picking up just there on racing is quite interesting. So I guess it's thinking about what's our goals in terms of post training or post race. Well, post training, if you're going to race again the next day, so say you've done an evening session, you're going to get up and do dare I say it, a swim session in the morning or whatever it might be, then your recovery becomes ultimately really important. So the timing and what you have becomes very important. If you've just done a big race, so say you finished Ironman, for example, or a 70.3 race, are you going to be racing or training the next day? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we trying to achieve from recovery there? Well, we're going to have muscle breakdown. We're going to be in a negative state in terms of our nitrogen balance, our protein balance. So that's going to happen. And actually, after a really big, long race, we'll probably never catch up with the amount of protein degradation, so the amount of muscle that's been breaking down. So ultimately, you might find that you can't eat very much after a big race. Is it really important? Well, yeah, actually, if we get recovery right, we might feel better the next day, but we're not going to be training the next day. So ultimately, if we think about those back-to-back training sessions, that's when it becomes important. Protein's probably the most researched macronutrient and still being researched. It is a little bit confusing, but keep it really super simple. Actually, again, having had some protein in your diet, say at breakfast and then and say at lunch, and then you're going to train, say at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll probably still have some of those amino acids or the breakdown of protein in your system anyway. So you're going to be taking those into the next training session. If you can eat as soon as possible after training, having protein with carbohydrate causes a spike in the level of insulin, so the hormone that takes the carbohydrate or the sugar out of the blood. Now, when it does that, it means that it can essentially, in a very simplistic way, pull the protein into the cells. So we actually may get better absorption of protein. So that's one of the reasons that we talk about having protein so quickly, so to speak, after training. But we know that recovery process can go on for 24, 72 hours after training. But I think you need to be on top of that recovery, because we also not only think about protein for recovery, carbohydrate, improving your and topping up your glycogen stores is really important. We're not so that we recover properly, and also from an immune health point of view as well. So optimizing our immune system as much as possible, making sure we're getting that carbohydrate in.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So I've got a question here from Janet. This is about timing of nutrition as well. Advice on early morning training. Training on an empty stomach, slow release carbs, protein, ? And recovery food. So basically, what's the best way to train if you're training best way to get some nutrition if you're training very early?
Again, really, really individual. So the athletes that I work with, if anyone's listening in today, they'll all be doing slightly different things. So what are your training goals ultimately? What's your training session? That would dictate what you do in the morning. So there's no one size fits all here, because if you are looking at training from a metabolic point of view, you might be doing something different in terms of you may actually be getting up and doing a fasted session. It could be that you're doing a 40-minute swim band session. So are you going to do that fasted, non-fasted? Are you going to the gym and you're doing an hour and a half? Are you doing a speed session in the pool? So what are your goals ultimately? How long is that session going to last for, and what's the intensity? That would dictate how much breakfast you have and what breakfast you have. Now, what I would say is if you're going to get up and train in the morning and you're going to have breakfast, then there's no point in doing it half an hour before. It either needs to be more than an hour before or like 10 minutes before. So you've got to think of 10 minutes before, a super quick, fast release. And I would say more liquidy in nature, otherwise it's just going to sit in your stomach. So if you're swimming, for example, you might be able to tolerate something like a banana, which would essentially give you 15 grams of carbs, which isn't very much for a training session, but it would give you something. But actually thinking about something more liquidy, it could be that you have a bottle of fruit smoothie, or it could be that you have a smoothie and a yogurt, for example, like a fruit yogurt. So you wouldn't be looking at something like a high protein yogurt or a Greek yogurt. It would need to be quicker release than that. So something liquidy in nature, if it's kind of like that hour just before. But it depends on how early you want to get up. I don't know what time your sessions are.
I mean, if we apply this to our early morning swim squad, so we start at 6 a.m. and there's travelling time before that, and they could either be speed work, an endurance session, or kind of something in the middle. So
Yeah.
around, can you give us some advice around those kind of sessions?
So, and really, again, going back to sort of where guidelines would sit, if you're doing a anything under an hour, usually we don't need to fuel that with extra carbohydrate, as long as you've had carbohydrate the night before and your glycogen stores are topped up. So that kind of filters into what we've just talked about, essentially. Now, if that session is really hard and you've got a speed session or a CSS session, and that it's going to be 40, even 45 minutes to an hour, then it's likely that we're going to need to top up those fuel sources before we go into that swim session. Now, if swimming starting at 6, people aren't going to be eating probably an hour before. They're going to be eating on the go in the car or just before they leave. And it's unlikely, I would say, that it's going to be more than an hour before that. So I would go with something really kind of liquidy in nature. So I would go for something like a smoothie, like a yogurt. If you can tolerate something like a banana, then that's fine. But something like a couple of pots of yogurt or a smoothie and a pot of yogurt would work really well. And you may even want to consider like a shot of caffeine in terms of coffee as well.
Yeah, we're not having them all having coffee poolside. We're not going to, don't give them any ideas. It's hard enough controlling them as it is. Oh, we've got another similar one here. Recommendations. It's along the same kind of lines. Before a 6 a.m. hard interval bike session. I guess it's a similar kind of thing as what you just said there.
Yeah, it would be really, really similar. And again, if you're going to do a hard interval session, then don't go into it. It's a bit like going into an FTP test and, trying to do that in an evening and not having had lunch and only had breakfast that day. It's a carbohydrate dependent session. So you need to have carbohydrate in your system. So making sure that we're not talking about having too much carbohydrate the night before, but as long as you've included some carbohydrate in your meal the night before, you should have topped up your glycogen stores. Again, I would say some quick release carbohydrates in that kind of hour beforehand.
Okay, good. And a question from Liz Flutie. Recovery, pros and cons of real food versus powdered stuff, and meal timings.
Okay, let's talk about food and powdered stuff. So interestingly, you touch on the powdered stuff. I think there's a time and place for everything. And again, we talked about not labeling food, not saying things are good or bad. Actually, if you're going to take a supplement, ask yourself really about its safety. Do you know where it's come from? Do you know why you're taking it? Do you know what it's got in it? Do you know how to take it, when to take it? Why would we take, for example, a protein powder over having real food? So that's a really good question. If you can be organized enough to take some food with you to have post-training, and it might be between, say, your swim session and driving into work, or it might be that you get into work and you can be in work and be eating sat down at your desk within an hour, then that's perfect. Real food is going to work really well. What we know about the use of things like protein powders for recovery is we need to think about where that protein powder is coming from. So we'd be looking at more of a whey-based supplement, what type of whey it is. So there's different types of whey in terms of how it's been fractioned or filtered. That will affect how quickly it's absorbed in the system as well. So you've got different types of whey products available. Then we need to think about how much protein that's got in as well. So most of those powdered protein products will have, you'll see will have around about sort of 20 to 25, 30 grams of protein, which is that kind of figure that we were talking about before. So if you are tight on time and you don't have access to food, or you really suffer with after training not feeling like you can eat, then the use of those kind of products, it's a good use of those kind of products, but make sure you eat within that hour if you can afterwards. They kind of pick up as soon as your appetite picks up. Make sure that you do get some food. But you would need to check that product, check what you're taking, check the quality of it, check what else it's got in it, check that it's tested as well. If we're athletes that are competing, we do need to check that all our products are tested. Now, some products will be tested through the informed sports method of testing, but not all companies will. So you just ask the company. They may have their own test certificate. So it's to an ISO standard, basically, of testing their products to make sure there's no banned substances in there. So ask yourself the question, what am I taking and what's it got in it? Now, like, there'll be a number of companies that add in 1 million products into that whey product. Essentially, all we really need is to know that it's really good quality, that it's very well absorbed, so the type of whey product that it is, and the amount of protein that it has in it as well.
And what would be the best way of? Because if you go into a health food shop, they have row upon row, shelf upon shelf of different types of protein. How is somebody supposed to know which one to buy?
Super simple. So a lot of my advice, as you might imagine, is so simple. So have a look for the products that really just say whey on it. So we're not looking at some hard gainer or some lean or whatever it might be. Go for the products that say whey on it. And the reason I'm talking about whey is because whey is the fraction of milk protein that is quicker release. You've got whey and casein. Casein is slow release. Whey is quick release. And then you need to look whether it's got whether it's isolate, whether it's concentrated, or whether it's the hydroslates in there. So you want a combination of isolates and hydroslates in it in terms of how it's absorbed and the quality of that protein that's within that product as well. So it's really simple, just isolate, hydroslates, whey product.
Yeah.
As long as it's got about 20 grams, but make sure it's tested. So it may be worth actually speaking to somebody like a performance nutritionist to actually work out, do you need it and what products do I need? I've saved athletes hundreds of pounds in terms of getting rid of supplements they don't need. And actually, I still talk to athletes every day that are taking supplements and have no idea why they're taking them, have no idea. And yet, if I gave you in my hand a bag of powder or a couple of pills, would you take them? Would you question? So question what you're buying. Really, really important. But I agree, there's so many products out there. But think simple, make sure it's tested. You just need a simple product that has 20 to 25 grams of protein in. Another important thing is just on the back to check the leucine content, which is one of the essential amino acids. We need about 3 grams of leucine. So you'll see on the back of the packet that it will say how much leucine it's got in it.
Okay, perfect. Well, Liz has come back to us there saying, I've tried some disgusting vegan powders. Sad face. Thanks very much.
Is she vegan? Is she vegan?
Liz is, yes.
Yeah. Okay, I was talking about whey. So whey is far superior. I would just say that. Vegan products, the problem with the vegan powders is they're less soluble. So whey and casein actually is less soluble as well. So most vegan protein powders, of course, are made out of things like soya or pea or hemp, often pumpkin as well. They're usually quite grainy and less soluble. So what they do is when you mix them, they often separate and they are very grainy. So that's the nature of the product itself. So you're never going to get away from that. A whey is very, very smooth and very kind of dairy tasting, and very quite sweet tasting as well. So it depends on what your recovery product is made out of. But it is going to affect the absorption rate as well. So depending on what's in that vegan product will depend on how quickly or how easily it's absorbed.
Right.
And actually there are questions whether using a soy-based product actually affects the absorption or how quickly that can be absorbed. And also the other important thing about a vegan supplement is looking to make sure it's got enough leucine in it. So it's important that we're looking for at least this 3 grams of leucine, and not every vegan protein supplement would have that in terms of, and that's to do with muscle protein synthesis, so remodeling, remaking, repairing muscle. So I would have a trial of a number of different products. I would use a smoothie maker to make it as smooth as possible. And I'd also trial it with a number of different plant-based milks as well, just to kind of smooth it out as much as you can. But it's always going to separate. That's
good. Well, hope that helps. Hope that helps, Liz. Oh, she's replied and says she's mostly vegan. So it depends how she's feeling at any given time, I think.
Okay. Well, if you're mostly vegan and need to use a protein supplement, I would maybe use your kind of less less vegan side of you to use the whey supplement, if I'm really honest.
Right. Okay. Good. We're going to start wrapping it up soon. We've got to come back from Nick here saying, so Nick is the chap we were speaking to earlier about the altitude. So
Yeah.
are there any advantages to training with little to no food? Does this teach the body to be more efficient with fuel or nutrition?
Oh, great question. So probably as an ultra runner, you're probably already very efficient at training. I think he's probably referring to as using fat as a fuel. So this is a form of fasted or metabolic training. And because ultra runners generally are racing and training at lower intensities, we are able to tap into our fat sources more easily. Now, we do need to train our bodies to be able to use both fuel sources, because and it depends what you do, Nick, in terms of your ultra running, because actually we know that ultra runners, because of the lower heart rates that you're running at, can actually take more real food on board than maybe somebody doing, or certainly somebody doing a sprint race triathlon would be able to take on board. So it may be that you're able to fuel with slightly higher fat or proteins even, later on into your races as well. If you're doing fasted training, and this is the ultimate question, and Nick, this is a whole, a good probably half a day's talk about in terms of fat as a fuel. So yes, we can teach our bodies to use it. It's a form of metabolic training, but it's how we do it. It's how you periodize doing that, and how you teach your body to be able to use fat as a fuel source. But if you also want to be able to use carbohydrate, you need to also train yourself with carbohydrate. Otherwise, you try and give yourself carbohydrate in a race, and your body or your gut isn't used to having that. So it's very much, I would say, get some advice if that's what you're trying to do or want to do. Because training in a fast state, if that's what he's talking about, he may be talking about using fat as a fuel for training. But training in a fasted state too often has negative consequences in terms of recovery, and also tipping us into that overtraining, but also opens up that window of opportunity in terms of picking up infections and viruses. So from an immune system point of view, really does open that window of opportunity.
Okay.
But it's a really good question, and I would say get some advice if that's something you're wanting to do or trialing.
Okay, perfect. Well, hopefully that's answered your question there, Nick. Well, we're pretty much at the hour now. So just on that point, if Nick or anyone else wants to get hold of you, Claire, how do they get hold of you?
Yep. So if you just drop me an email, so you can either contact me if you want to drop me a message on Instagram, or if you want to contact me through my website, you can just press the contact me button, and I'll get back to you. But yeah, I'm pretty responsive on both. So just let us know your questions, and yeah, I'll be happy to help.
And that's the fourth discipline.
It is, yeah. It's fourthdiscipline.co.uk.
Okay.
And on Instagram, it's the Fourth Discipline.
Okay, great. Well, Claire, I think we're pretty much done. I thank you very much for your time.
No worries.
I've managed to go an hour without any chocolate, so you've helped me as well.
Well, there you go. So the question is, when you're busy, you don't need it, right?
That's it. I need to stay busy all the time. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off. Well, thank you very much. Hope everyone else has found that useful. I'm sure we'll do that again at some point in the future. But that's been really good. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thank you.